With the fresh installation of the API platform, we can use HTTPS, and in order to do so, we'll need to use the port 8443. Now this setup uses a self-signed certificate, which is why you've got the warning not to use this in production, but for development purposes, it's really quite nice. Now because we're using a self-signed certificate, you may need to accept a prompt inside your browser. I haven't needed to in this instance. Where things get a little bit trickier though is in Postman. This probably won't work first time. Certainly not if you get your port and your protocol wrong like I have here. Even so, once you get your setup sorted out, if you try and send in a GET request to the root, you'll likely find that you can't get any response. And as it does quite helpfully suggest, it's probably that self-signed SSL certificates are being blocked. Now fixing this is just a matter of going into the options and turning off SSL certificate verification, after which time you should be able to make a request without Postman giving you any more complaints. Now in making this request, we're going to hit our entry point, and as part of the entry point output, we're seeing that JSON-LD is providing us with some information about a context. So the context and the entry point are perhaps two of the biggest differences that you'll notice compared with a typical Symfony project. The word context is one of my least favourite words in computer science. I find the term to be vague and confusing, and that's a bit unusual really, because the entire point of the context is to be as descriptive and helpful as possible. Now what you're seeing on screen at the moment is part of the documentation for JSON-LD. JSON linking data is what that stands for. And as we'll see in a minute, the routing format that we're going to use will involve a short name and then some format. So a short name in our case is going to be greeting, and a little later on it's going to be album. So you can think of like the short name as a key, so in our case greeting or album will be our key, and then the value will tell the consumer of our API where to go to find more information. So it could be that if we're talking about greetings, then to find out more about what a greeting is, like what the fields are and things like that represent a greeting, you would go to /context/greeting. Now optionally you can also supply a format, but to the best of my knowledge this only supports JSON-LD, and that's because the concept of a context is specific to JSON-LD. The short name can be explicitly defined for any of the resources that we're going to create. A default is guessed for any of our annotated entities. Anyway, you don't really need to worry about guessing the short names of your resources. The correct link to the related context is returned whenever you do a GET request to a valid resource, and we'll see this again shortly. Now, any resource that we consume, so any endpoint in effect that's using JSON-LD, is going to come with a context property. This is a special reserved keyword in JSON-LD, and the context value may contain a string or an array or an object. API platform returns an object, and that's denoted by the use of the handlebars. This is the standard syntax for representing an object in JavaScript, and anything within this object is intended to teach us as the API consumers about the intent of this resource. So we're being told about the vocabulary, which is the list of words and terms that our API uses. And we can also see that we can find more about this by browsing locally to docs.jsonld. There's a link to the Hydra spec. We saw a screenshot of this a little earlier. It's worthwhile taking a look through this if you're working with JSON-LD in any way. Finally, the name is given, and this has the type set to greeting/name, which is itself a link, but weirdly it's a 404. Now we're going to fix this by defining exactly what the concept of a greeting represents. But in order to do that, we need to get a little bit more abstract and think about what is a greeting. Well, there's actually a full list of things that a greeting might be over on schema.org. And at its most abstract, the greeting may just be a thing. Now the idea is that for each property on our resource, we should be able to find out a little bit more about it. And in this case, we can't because it's a 404. So what we can do is annotate, in this case, the name property and describe the IRI, which is an internationalized routing identifier. Yeah, I had to look that up. And point it to the thing that this represents on schema.org. Now schema.org itself is quite an interesting site. It's worth a few minutes of your time just to have a browse around it. And it essentially contains this massive hierarchy of vocabularies that we can use to describe what it is that our API represents. It's quite a strange concept. But in essence, it aids with the discoverability of our API. It helps not just us as humans, but also computers, like Google, for example. This could be really useful when Google comes to index your site. Now there is one other thing here. If you've got some 404s like we have, such as that name property that's 404 in, then you're probably going to want to fix this in terms of your SEO. Likewise, if you care about developer usability, then you're probably going to want to fix this as well. If you don't care about any of that stuff, then, don't bother. Now, there's actually a full component that helps with the management and maintenance of your schema, and we will get back to this shortly. For now, I'm going to use the API Platform's API Property Annotation to describe the IRI, again, the Internationalized Resource Identifier, that says our name property represents a name in terms of schema.org's vocabulary. The upshot of all this extra effort on our part is that now when we browse our API and we look at the context of a greeting, our name should point to schema.org/name. And hopefully you can imagine at this point that if all the resources exposed by our API contained this much information, particularly when combined with API Platform's already brilliant automatically generated documentation, this makes for a really nice experience for whoever it is that's consuming our API.